The air in St. Hedwig's was soft with the scent of lavender polish and warmed scones on this particular Saturday afternoon. The rectory garden was abuzz with villagers attending the annual Candlemas charity tea, a Gentile affair organized by Mrs. Hermione Clara with ruthless efficiency and just enough charm to keep anyone from openly resenting her lace-covered tables dotted the lawn. Their teacups gleaming in the brittle sunlight, children played near the trimmed hedges. Hermione Clara, tall and brisk, rang a silver bell beside the tier, everyone before refilling their cups. A quick word: will be lighting the ceremonial candle in just a moment this year, graciously donated by our very own Miss Clara Renori. Hand-dipped beeswax blessed by the bishop himself. There was tepid applause, except from the table where Clara Renishaw herself sat, lips pressed together too tightly for pride. A frugal, grayed woman in her 50s, Clara was known for her silent disapproval of frivolity and her unnerving punctuality. Odd choice, that candle murmured. Major, her gaze lingered on the candle, thick pale ivory and bound at its base by a loop of twine that looked far too deliberate to be decorative. A little old for superstition, Jane told herself, but habits die hard in St. Mary Me, especially those involving rituals cloaked in charity. As the sun dipped behind a drifting cloud, Hermione lit the candle with a theatrical flourish. For a time, everything was calm. The flame blazed high, too high, and sputtered with a hiss, then silence. Someone chuckled uncomfortably. A breeze ruffled the leaves, and then came the scream, which cut through the garden like a snapped wire. Mrs. Charity Foyle, a former actress and notorious embellisher, stood clutching her chest. It was Clara Renishaw, and she had fainted. The scene that followed was practiced chaos, with chairs scraped, tea spilled, and voices tangled. Dr. Hugh Morton was summoned from the lemonade table, crouched beside Clara's prone body, and he took her wrist, checked her pupils, and slowly stood. "I'm afraid," he began, brushing a spot of wax from his sleeve. "Miss Renner is dead." GPS rippled like cold wind. "But she was just fine a moment ago." Mrs. Delford cried, forgetting her bell. "Entirely natural causes," muttered the vicar, as if pronouncing it would make it true. Miss Marple said nothing. Her gaze had returned to the candle. It burned low, now its flame steady and meek. The twine had fallen free. A dark curl of soot danced along the wax. She reached for her knitting and resumed her stitches. Though her eyes remained distant, Clara Reneur was not a woman prone to dramatics, nor did she have any known ailments serious enough to take her breath mid-miss. Marple had seen many strange things in her years, and this death on Candlemas after a blessing in a garden where everyone was looking was just weird enough to imply it had been intentionally and deliberately prepared. Chapter 2. Dr. Hugh Morton stood at the garden bench where Clara Renishaw's body had been properly covered with a shawl, his brow furrowed not with urgency but with worry. He hadn't expected this afternoon to finish with a death certificate. "I can't say for certain," he mumbled, half to himself, half to Hermione Clara, but there was no convulsion, no gripping of the breast, no struggle for air. She merely sank silently. Mrs. Clara's voice lowered to a whisper. "You think it could be poison?" The doctor straightened. "I said nothing of the sort." Miss Marple, now seated closer to the gathering cluster of well-meaning onlookers, glanced up from her knitting. Her hands moved steadily, the soft click of needles seeming almost louder in the hush that had fallen. Constable Derek Whitting approached with the cautious energy of a young man not quite comfortable in his boots. "Should I phone headquarters, Dr. Morton? Do we treat this as suspicious?" Clara Renishaw was a woman of regular routines and plain living. The doctor responded that there were no known ailments or cause for anxiety, which makes it unique and recurring. Miss Marple gently, more to herself than anyone else. "She did look pale earlier," added Mrs. Charity. Foyle appeared conveniently with a handkerchief she hadn't yet used. "I mentioned it to her, but Clara always shrugged me off, stubborn as a mule." Hermione's eyes furrowed. "You hadn't spoken in 3 years, Charity." "Yes, but I still have eyes, don't I? And instincts. As an actor, one perceives things." "I dare say Clara wasn't interested in dramatic instincts," mumbled Major Grimsley. Miss Marple's attention had shifted. She was studying the table, more specifically the single plate before. Clara's empty seat, only a crust of scone remained, one bite taken, no teacup. Odd, everyone else had a cup, Hermione quietly said. Did Clara drink tea? Of course, always took it black, no sugar. Why, there's no cup, Miss Marple mumbled. Maybe she hadn't yet, but I fetched it myself. Dorothy Pike, a local girl in her early 20s, cheeks still pink from running lemonade earlier. Miss Renishaw asked me to get her tea while she found her seat, saying her knees were acting up. I gave it to her just before the candle was lit. Where is it now? Miss Marple asked. I don't know. I think it must have been cleared already. Dorothy turned to the tables. There were so many cups. Constable Whitting lifted his chin. We'll need to collect all the teacups and any food Miss Renaud might have eaten, bag them, and take them to the station. Miss Marple stood slowly, her knitting looped neatly into her handbag. If I may suggest, Derek, it would be wise to also preserve the candle and the twine that fell from its base. I noticed it was quite tightly knotted. The constable blinked. The candle, the ceremony symbol, was provided by the victim. Wouldn't you agree it's relevant? Miss Marple stood behind and watched the candle's last inch of wax give up its flame with a quiet sigh. Wax had pulled at its base, congealing around a small speck of soot that resembled a fingerprint. Or perhaps that was just her imagination. She didn't believe in curses, but she did believe in long-lasting bitterness that felt like one. Chapter 3. Rain came gently on St. Mary the following morning. A fine drizzle that powdered the hedge and turned the stone walkways into moist slate. From her front window, Miss Marple watched the hamlet rise slower than normal, as if the entire parish had agreed to talk in whispers for the day. A tap on her door disturbed the silence. It was Reverend Simon Cresswell. Was tall, mild-mannered, and usually seemed engaged with deeper concerns. His face was pale beneath his umbrella, but not from the rain. "Might I bother you for a few minutes?" he began, his voice low. She allowed him in without ceremony and gestured toward the fire. "Of course, Reverend, you're troubled, I take it." "I am," he admitted, sitting stiffly. "I did the blessing over that candle yesterday. If Clara's death turns out to be unnatural, I fear people may consider it as a sign of a curse." Miss Marple brought him tea. "In my experience, Reverend, curses are typically the result of guilt clothed in poetry." Cresswell blinked. "You think someone is guilty, and I think someone wished. It is unclear if Clara Renishaw died as a result of poisoning or spiritual hexing." He took the tea but did not drink the candle. He murmured, "Miss Renner brought it in herself, insisted it be used even over the church's usual stock. I thought her overly particular, but she was adamant." "Did she say why? Only that it had meaning for her tradition?" She called it. Miss Marple noted the phrasing tradition, not religion. Clara had never been overtly spiritual, scrupulous, yes, pious. No. The conversation was interrupted by another knock, this time Dorothy Pike rang. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Come in, child." "What's the matter?" Dorothy clutched her hands tightly. "It's about the tea, the cup I gave Miss Renaud. I didn't think anything of it yesterday, but I saw something I didn't want to say in front of everyone." Reverend Cresswell gave her space to sit, and Miss Marple offered her a clean handkerchief. Dorothy's voice quivered when I handed her the cup. She took one sip and grimaced, saying it tasted odd. I offered to fetch another, but she said no, not to fret. I thought possibly the pot had gone bitter, and you didn't see anyone else near her. "Tea?" Miss Marple inquired softly. Dorothy hesitated, but Mr. Lionel roused as he passed by just as I handed her the cup, saying something like, "Even poisons are better than this weather." I thought it was just one of his jokes. "You know how he is, Miss Marple." Did Lionel stir? The retired solicitor from London had moved to the village 3 years ago. He was known for his acidic wit and an unfortunate talent for inserting himself where he wasn't needed, so even a joke in that context felt sour. Did Clara react? Miss Marple asked. She looked up abruptly, didn't laugh, but stared after him for a long period. then sipped again. Dorothy's eyes filled, and now she's dead. No one's blaming you, my dear Miss Marple said softly, but your memory may be significant. Could you write it down for Constable Whitting? Dorothy nodded gratefully and left after another time. Cresswell sipped his now cold tea. You believe it's murder, don't you? Miss Marple folded her hands. I believe Miss Renori was not well liked, and that someone may have exploited the performance of tradition to hide a personal act of vengeance. The Reverend shivered. Miss Marple rose and moved to the bureau, retrieving a small notebook. There is something else, she said half to herself. Clara didn't drink tea with milk, and yet, when Dorothy served her, the pot on the table was already creamed and sugared. Cresswell blinked, but she always took it black. Miss Marple repeated, but said nothing about it. Why would she do that unless she didn't want to draw attention? She slowly closed the notepad. No, she mumbled. She knew something, and someone knew she knew. Chapter 4. Lionel Sturr stood in the sunlit corner of the library at his home, thumbing through the current issue of the Law Gazette with theatrical indifference. The rustle of the paper hid his expectation, and he had no doubt Miss Marple would come, and when she did, he opened the door before she could knock, and he remarked with a grin that was too quick to be genuine, "Come to formally accuse me." Miss Marple returned the smile mildly. I thought it was better to ask you about your sense of humor before others misunderstood it. He led her inside, waving vaguely toward a pair of armchairs. Tea? No thank you, he poured for himself anyway, heavily. Sugared? You're referring, I suppose, to my remark yesterday about poison. Bad timing, I'll admit, but hardly damning. You knew Miss Renishawar as well as anyone could. She was the sort to dislike you first, and then decide whether to tall. Miss Marple watched his face as he spoke. His words were precise and confident, but his left foot tapped once, twice under the table. You spoke to her before. The candle was lit. He gave a short laugh. I did make a joke. She didn't find it funny, but then she rarely did. She didn't accuse you of anything, and I didn't poison her teacup, if that's where this is headed. Miss Marple smiled gently. It's not. She rose. Tell me, Mr. Sturr, do you believe in curses? He scoffed. No more than I believe in ethical politicians. Why? She paused at the doorway. Because I think Miss Renner did, and someone made sure that belief killed her outside. The village hummed faintly. Miss Marple didn't go home. Instead, she turned toward the post office inside. Mrs. Crabbe, the postmistress, adjusted her spectacles with suspicion. Another death. I always knew something like this would happen. That Reneur Crabbe's eyes narrowed. Now that you mention it, yes, 2 days ago. Very stiff paper, scented oddly enough, sent to Clara, and she didn't look pleased receiving it. Do you know who posted it? Didn't come through the usual box. Someone dropped it directly at the desk. Local gloved hands. I remember thinking it was a woman, tall, wearing a dark shawl. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Thank you, Mrs. Crabbe, you've been very helpful. She returned home just before dusk, the mist curling along the hedge. Miss Marple read it twice and carefully folded it. The Major's brow furrowed. What do you think it means? She met his eyes, which meant she calmly stated that Clara Renaud was not the intended victim. And for the first time in this case, Miss Marple felt the ground shift. Chapter 5. By Monday morning, the drizzle had faded into a dull, expectant gray, the sort of weather that left the villagers of St. Mary restless behind their lace curtains at the station. Constable Whitting was elbowed deep in teacups, biscuit tins, and crumbling witness statements, none of which had yet revealed much of anything. Miss Marple arrived with a wool shawl and quiet determination. I wonder, she began, if I might see the candle. Whitting blinked. It's in the back. There's something strange about the wick, she said. Strange how? Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Her fingers moved carefully over the edges of the stub. It burnt. Too quickly, she murmured finally. Too brightly at first. That kind of flare suggests something in the wick. Something added. You think it was tampered with? I think it may have been prepared for effect, to make a show of something, or to hide it. Constable Whitting looked puzzled. Hide what exactly? That said, Miss Marple, is what we must find out. She returned to the village on foot, stopping not at her own home, but at the cottage of Clara Renori. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, The garden was neatly kept, cold weather pansies clipped, ivy, no weed in sight. Clara had been nothing if not tidy. The door was opened by a relative, Mr. Alfred Reneshaw, summoned from Cheltenham to see to matters. He wore a black wool suit and the attitude of a man already calculating inheritance. "I'm afraid I don't have much time, Miss Marple," he added, solicitors. "And such I won't stay long. I'm merely curious, did Clara retain letters raised in eyebrow letters? She received one lately, odd paper red wax seal, smelled good Lord, sounds like something out of a Gothic novel. She wasn't delighted to receive it." He hesitated, then groaned. "You might try her writing desk. She was private, yes, but not entirely secretive." Not entirely. He led her to the drawing room. Clara's desk was immaculate, everything aligned to the edge. Miss Marple didn't disturb the arrangement. She only opened the second drawer, where bills and correspondence were neatly bound by month. The letter was there, thick paper, sharp edges, a whiff of roses and wood smoke. The seal had broken, and tucked inside, "No return." Address. The note read, "You promised Alfred," muttered over her shoulder, and cryptic. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the waste-bin nearby. Nothing crumpled, only a wax-stained matchbox and the stub of a torn calendar page. February 2nd was marked with an X beneath it. In faint pencil it ends at. The lighting closed the drawer. Quietly back outside, she paused beneath the eaves. Clara had known the threat was real. She hadn't warned anyone. Why? Out of pride or fear? As she turned onto the lane, she nearly collided with her. Clara emerged from the hedge path in a stiff skirt and sharper expression. "Miss Marple," she said, forcing civility, "I suppose you're gathering theories, merely facts. Then gather this. The whole village is in a fit over curses and poisoned cups, and it's making committee work quite impossible. I imagine so." Hermione hesitated, then added, "Clara was no friend to me, but I didn't wish her dead." "No," said Miss Marple, "but someone else certainly did." Hermione's gaze darted to the sky. "I hope you find them." Jane left with a swish of her coat before someone else's candle burned out. Miss Marple stood still for a long time, watching the mist slowly unravel from the chimney tops. A poisoned cup, a burned candle, and a letter written not in malice but in warning. Someone had feared what Clara might say, and someone else had made sure she never said it. Chapter 6. It was just past 6 when Miss Marple climbed the path to the vicarage, her boots leaving soft imprints on the damp earth. A light glowed in the study window, and she could make out the silhouette of Reverend Cresswell, pacing slowly, hands clasped behind his back, head bowed in thought. She knocked once. He opened the door quickly, as if he'd been expecting her. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing her inside. "I admit I hoped you might come." The vicarage was modest but neat, with the books lining the shelf and the aroma of pipe tobacco still lingering in the draperies. A fire crackled gently in the hearth, but Cresswell didn't sit. He remained near the window. "They're claiming it was poison. People always say such things." Miss Marple responded kindly, "even when they haven't the faintest notion what they mean." Cresswell flashed a sorrowful grin. "But you believe that, don't you?" "I believe someone once." Miss Renishaw silenced, she said, and that the timing during a religious ritual no less was intended to obscure, not illuminate. She waited a beat, then added, "She was very insistent the candle be used. You said so yourself." "Yes." He turned from the window. "She brought it in the day before, claimed it had significance. I thought she meant spiritual, but now." He paused. "Now, I wonder, did she speak to you privately, confide anything?" Cresswell hesitated. "She asked me hypothetically about morals." Miss Marple nodded and did not identify anyone by name. She breathed only once in passing, saying, "Even those who wear collars are capable of cruelty." "I thought she meant her father. He was once a clergyman, you know, and rather a severe one." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her handbag. "And did she attend confession often?" "Never. She said she preferred her soul unmediated." At that Miss Marple stood. "I won't keep you longer, Reverend, but there's something else. I must ask who had access to the candle before the ceremony." Cresswell blinked. "Why, I suppose I did." The girl jumped as she turned. Miss Marple, I'm sorry I didn't see you out for a walk in the dark. Dorothy blushed. I come here to think about Miss Rainier. Dorothy looked down. She was strict with me, always watching. Once she accused me of stealing a pastry from the vicarage kitchen. I hadn't, but she made me feel like I had. Did you ever notice her meeting anyone? Dorothy hesitated. Yes, once a week ago. I saw her talking to Mrs. Delford at the back of the church. It looked tense. Mrs. Clara was holding something. A can. Mrs. Delford was irritated as Dorothy nodded, and Clara simply gave up the candle, as if she didn't want it. Thank you, Dorothy, Miss Marple whispered softly. You've helped more than you know. She continued home in silence, her mind working methodically. The candle had changed hands. It was no longer speculation. It was fact. Mrs. Delford had held it and possibly prepared it. But was Clara the intended victim? No, there was still that note. The true target was someone else entirely, someone who hadn't yet realized they had survived a murder. Chapter 7. The next morning brought crisp sunlight and the illusion of peace. But St. Mary Mead, beneath its quiet hedgerows and ivy-covered walls, had begun to vibrate with speculation. Clara Renisho's death had passed beyond grief into something far more potent: curiosity laced with fear. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Marple rang the doorbell at Rosebank House. Clara responded with an odd smile, dressed neatly in blue wool and pearl earrings. Jane, she began, standing aside. I thought you might call. Miss Marple entered without comment. The drawing room was neat but not warm, and the fire remained unlit. Hermione poured tea, her hand swift but not quivering. Milk, no thank you. They sat. Miss Marple stirred her cup slowly. Dorothy Pike mentioned she saw you with a candle the morning of the tea. Hermione's hand froze briefly over the sugar bowl. I collect candles, she said smoothly, for church functions. I've dozens. One of them was donated for the ceremony. Yes, but I let Clara take over. She wanted control. Did you notice anything unusual about it? Hermione's gaze sharpened. You're suggesting I tampered with it. I'm suggesting you had it in your possession, and that Clara later insisted it be used, even though she appeared afraid of something. Hermione set her cup down. Clara was afraid of everything, Jane. Her past, her neighbors, her own shadow. I pied her, but I didn't envy her. She was always waiting for someone to expose her for something. What sort of something? Hermione leaned back. I don't know, but she was rattled, especially after receiving that letter. You saw it. She showed it to me. We were meant to reconcile over tea. Instead, she arrived furious, claimed someone was threatening her over a past she claimed wasn't hers. She said if they wouldn't stop, she'd speak up. And who was they? She never said, just stared at the candle like it was a noose. Miss Marple sipped her tea. She also received another message slipped under Major Thomas' door that said it wasn't meant for her. Hermione flinched. That frightens you. It should frighten anyone, shouldn't it? Hermione's voice dropped. You think she was killed by mistake? I think someone wanted her silent and used an act of tradition to ensure it. But if she wasn't the intended target, then we must ask who sat where she did. Hermione looked genuinely startled. It was meant to be my C. Miss Marple raised her head slightly, but Clara arrived early. She insisted on switching, claiming she had knee problems, but now I wonder if I do too. A lengthy quiet stretched between them. Miss Marple inquired gently, is there anything else I should know about Hermione? There was a flash behind her eyes as pride wrestled with terror. I received a letter last week, same paper, no seal. It said, you cannot rewrite the past, but you can confess it. I burned it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A pattern is forming outside the village. Clock struck 11. Later that afternoon at the Pas Perdu, a pattern is forming outside the village. Clock struck 11. Later that afternoon at the Vungun at the Vataju. Apothecaries on Littlecombe Lane. Miss Marple requested oil for her rheumatism and a quiet word with Mr. Finch, the pharmacist. Have you sold any uncommon compounds recently? She asked Finch. A thin man with a memory like a ledger thought carefully. Nothing odd though. Last week, Clara Renner purchased orris root and a vial of eucalyptus extract, saying she needed them for A personal preparation, very precise, very firm, about dosage orris root. Miss Marple echo Clara had prepared the candle herself, but someone else had assured it would never reach its intended flame. Chapter 8. It was dusk when Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the wind teasing the curtains through a barely cracked window. She sat at her writing desk, sorting through her notes, a delicate tapestry of gestures, half-truths, and positioning. Clara had planned something. She had crafted the candle herself, chosen or root not for decoration, but to carry a scent. Deliberate, traceable, but the true question wasn't how she dyed it, was why the switch happened. There came a knock, quick and hesitant. Dorothy Pike stood on the stepcoat, buttoned wrong, eyes rimmed with tears. May I come in?" "Of course, dear." Dorothy stepped inside, twisting her gloves. "I need to tell you something. I should have said before, it's about the seating at the tea." Miss Marple offered her a cup of warm barley tea, but said nothing, giving the girl space. "I overheard Mrs. Delford arguing with Clara that morning." Dorothy continued. "Clara wanted the first seat by the candle, said she needed to be seen near it." Mrs. Delford was furious. "Did she explain why?" She said Clara was trying to turn the event into something personal, that she was using it to make a statement. "I didn't understand then, but now." Miss Marple nodded. "Did you notice anything else?" Dorothy hesitated. "Yes, just before the ceremony began, Clara pulled me aside. She told me very seriously to make sure Hermione sat one seat to the left, and did you? I tried, but Hermione wouldn't move, so Clara sat there instead." Miss Marple sat back, brows lightly raised. "So it wasn't chance Clara insisted on that seat. She knew what would happen when the candle was lit. She was laying a trap." Dorothy looked down, but it turned on her. "No," said Miss Marple softly. "Someone else turned it." That night, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, this time unannounced. Reverend Cresswell responded promptly, a look of surprise on his face. "I apologize for intruding," she added gently, "but I must ask who lit the candle?" He gazed down at Mrs. Delford. "Not you, no. I was preparing the psalm reading." She asked if she might do it. It seemed innocuous at the moment. Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Clara Renishaw didn't die by mistake. The candle was meant to expose something, but when Mrs. Clara took control of the lighting, the plan unraveled. I believe she knew or suspected what Clara had done." Cresswell sank into a chair, face pale. "But surely that's not sure." "She wouldn't." Miss Marple said nothing. She only handed him the folded note. Dorothy had copied Clara's precise words seconds before her death. "Let her sit there. It had to be her." The vicar read the line twice, and the wavering candlelight appeared to shiver with it. "Dear Lord," he whispered, "she was trying to trap someone." Miss Marple nodded once, but someone else arrived first. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to Rosebank House, but this time Hermione Delford did not answer the door. Instead, it was the maid cowering in her study. She received something this morning, a letter from Miss Marple. Hermione sat by the window, a pale envelope in her fingers. Her face was motionless, but her eyes, those piercing eyes, conveyed terror. She held out the message, which read, "You took her place, but your secret is still burning." Hermione's voice cracked. "It wasn't meant for Clara, was it?" Hermione stood abruptly. "She was going to expose me. I knew it. She'd discovered something, a letter from years ago. I thought if I could get to the candle first, switch the seats back, maybe frighten her into silence, but I never meant for her to die." Miss Marple's voice was calm, but someone else did. Hermione closed her eyes. "And now I don't know if they're watching me or waiting." Miss Marple didn't respond. She simply Chapter 9. The village of St. Mary Me wore its silence differently now. It was no longer the comfortable quiet of knitted shawls and clipped hedges, but a watchful one, as if even the stones underfoot were listening. Miss Marple walked slowly along Church Lane, letting her thoughts settle like leaves in still water. Someone had rewritten Clara Renner's plan. She had intended to expose a secret using the candle, its scent, its placement, its symbolism, but someone else had turned that Clara, a week before Candelmas, about what she said she had reason to believe. Something had been buried years ago, not literally, mind you. Figuratively, that something had happened at the vicarage before Reverend Cresswell took over something involving a girl. Miss Marple's gaze didn't shift. She didn't name anyone, she only said that a letter had come into her possession, something never meant to be found. And did she show you this letter? Hesitated. No. But she said it proved someone. Miss Marple set her cup down, and Clara believed this secret was dangerous, she said. It was rotting the village from the inside. Her words, not mine. Miss Marple stood slowly. One more question. Major, did Clara seem frightened of someone in particular? Grimsley paused. Not frightened exactly, but wary of someone who hides things well. She didn't say who. Miss Marple left shortly after, mind-spinning. Clara had uncovered a sin buried deep, not spiritual but social. Someone's past had not only returned, but threatened to unravel their present by noon. Mr. Finch looked up wearily as she entered. I was wondering, Miss Marple said, if you keep records of unusual purchases. Some, he explained. Depends on what and when. Would anyone recently have requested powdered belladonna or something with similar properties? He blinked. That's restricted. I'd never sell it casually, but someone might ask. He nodded reluctantly. Last month, an anonymous note left in the box asked for a blend that would induce stillness without alarm. I declined because it seemed dangerous. Did you keep the note? He produced it from a drawer, scrap of lined paper with neat, tidy script. Miss Marple folded it carefully that night, comparing the handwriting to the torn note slipped under Major Thomas' door, a perfect match. She sat both down and looked towards the flickering fire. Then she reached for the third note Clara had received, the one that smelled faintly of wood smoke and warning, and the same hand. 3 notes, 3 voices. One writer in the village had crafted not only a murder, but also a narrative. They had framed Clara's fears as paranoia and anticipated Hermione's guilt. Dorothy's confusion, the vicar's quiet shame, they had counted on a candle to cover their tracks, but what they hadn't counted on was Clara's final act, placing herself in the seat intended for someone else, a self-made martyr. And now Miss Marple had one more call to make. As the clock chimed 8, she walked quietly to the vicarage once more. This time not for confession, but for confrontation. She wasn't yet ready to speak the killer's name, but she knew where the fire had started. Chapter 10. The vicarage was still when Miss Marple arrived. The path was damp with early frost, and a crow called once from the faro. Reverend Cresswell answered the door in shirt sleeves, surprise etched on his tired face. She stepped inside with quiet certainty. I believe we must speak plainly now, Reverend. Before anyone else is harmed, he led her to the study where the fire had long since died to embers. Papers lay scattered on the desk, a parish notice, half-written sermon, and beneath them a page torn from an old attendance register. You've been looking for Miss Marple noted. I have. His voice was steady but hollow. Clara was right. Something was hidden about the girl who vanished. He nodded. Her name was Ivy Holloway, and she worked here as a domestic assistant under the prior vicar. She was just 16 years old, and she disappeared one spring night. There was no police investigation, and the narrative faded like a pour. Quickly and discreetly, Miss Marple sat down, and there was a letter she had written to a schoolmistress before she vanished. It surfaced recently. Clara found it among a box of parish donation records. The letter hinted at something improper, a betrayal. It never named the man involved, but it mentioned a promise made in the sacristy. Miss Marple's eyes didn't leave his. And you think Clara believed the former vicar was responsible? No, Cresswell said, and here his voice trembled. She believed it was so, but you didn't like it. Miss Marple added. Hermione did. She offered, and Clara said nothing. She said nothing. Miss Marple echoed, because by then she was no longer playing a game. She was afraid someone had tampered with the candle, and she realized too late that she'd been outmaneuvered. The Reverend's breath caught. Then she sat down and waited to see if her death would speak louder than her voice. Miss Marple withdrew 3 folded notes from her handbag, all written by the same hand. The menacing letter to Clara that wasn't meant for her message was slipped to Grimsley, and the request placed at the apothecary asking for a substance. To induce immobility without alarm, Cresswell leaned forward. "You know who wrote them?" Miss Marple nodded once, and everything settled on the false path. Clara had left the switch-in chairs, the wax prepared with scent, the candle lit by the wrong person, and most importantly, the person who knew exactly what Ivy Holloway's perfume smelled like. Miss Marple stood. "I must ask you to keep this conversation between us for the time being, because what comes next requires orchestration." He looked at her with quiet awe. "You already know how you'll prove it, don't you?" She gave the smallest smile. "Not proven courage, the truth in my experience prefers to reveal itself when it feels safe enough to speak." She left the vicarage as the bells began to toll the hour, not a joyful chime, but something lower. The village would wake soon, and by the time it did, someone would be standing too close to a truth they thought. Buried in Wax and Silence, Chapter 11. Miss Marple's drawing room was warm with the aroma of beeswax polish and cardamom biscuits. The tea was set neatly, 3 cups and no sugar. One guest expected another, who was already seated. Hermione Clara perched at the edge of the flowered armchair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Am I to assume this is an ambush?" she murmured, voice scratchy. "Not at all," Miss Marple said gently. "Merely a gathering of shared interests. You wanted answers, and I thought you should be present to hear them." There was a knock. Miss Marple opened the door to reveal Lionel St. "Well," he replied, looking between the two women, "this is cozy." He took his seat without being asked, and he looked like a man who thought he was 2 steps ahead of everyone else. A frequent observer who was overly confident in his own charm. Miss Marple offered tea. "Don't mind if I do," she poured carefully, then set the last cup aside untouched. "I've been thinking about the Kendalmas ceremony," she started, "and how Clara Renisherworth chose her seat so deliberately. She meant to expose someone. But the candle didn't go as planned. Someone else changed it." Stirred his tea. "Lazily, you do love a twist, Miss Marple." Hermione said nothing, her gaze fixed on the untouched cup. Miss Marple continued, "I also discovered something curious at the apothecary. A note requesting a compound that induces stillness, not death. Just the appearance of it. A temporary paralysis. It was rejected, but the handwriting matched 2 previous notes." Hermione looked up shocked as she took the folded pages from her knitting bag and placed them on the side table. "You think Clara meant only to frighten someone?" "Exactly," Miss Marple remarked. "A faked breakdown, a fainting fit to draw attention, to force a confrontation. But someone used her plan against her, swapped the wick, placed something real into the candle, and let Clara sit in her own trap." Stir's smile faltered for the first time. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the untouched teacup. "Curious, isn't it?" She said lightly that the person who slipped that note beneath Major Thomas' door, it wasn't meant for her, knew precisely which seat had been intended for whom, a detail only 3 people could have known. Hermione swallowed hard. "You don't mean—" Miss Marple talked gently. "Clara was trying to trap someone, but she confided her plan too broadly, and someone rewrote it." She turned to Lionel St. "You worked in law, Mr. St. You'd know how to write threatening notes with just the right ambiguity. You'd know how to handle gloves, paper, wax, how to avoid fingerprints, and most importantly, you were one of the few villagers who remembered Ivy Holloway." His face twitched. "Ivy," he said as if tasting the name. For the first time in years, she was nothing. "No," Marple answered. "She was a girl alone, taken advantage of. And when Clara found the letter Ivy wrote before vanishing, you panicked not because you feared exposure, but because you feared she'd speak too soon." Hermione glanced at him, horrified. "She told me she'd been watched," she muttered. "Followed. At night." Miss Marple nodded lightly. "You tried to shift suspicion onto Clara. Herself poisoned her tea, too risky, but a candle when meant to alarm could be altered to kill." Stir's fists clutched the porcelain. "She ruined everything," he murmured. Slowly, She dug up a life I'd left behind, and I built something here, so I mattered again. Miss Marple's voice, like a thread of silk. You murdered a woman to protect a falsehood. Stud stood too soon. The teacup clattered on the saucer, and I suppose this talk is over. Miss Marple did not move, so you might wish to sit. Mr. Agitated. The constable. Whitting is outside the gate, and I suspect he'd want to chat. The silence that followed wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. Hermione covered her mouth, her eyes wide. Sturt's face drained of color, and Miss Marple leaned forward. Softly, "Curious thing about wax," she whispered. "It holds fingerprints even after it cools." Chapter 12. By the time Constable Whitting led Lionel, Stir away quiet pale and finally stripped of pretense, the village had already begun to buzz. Not with celebration, but with subdued murmurs behind half-closed doors at Rosebank House. Hermione. Delford stood with her hands still hovering above the cold tea tray. She turned slowly toward Miss Marple. He was always polite, always correct. I never imagined Miss Marple's voice was soft. Predators rarely growl when they mean to ling Miss Marple. Agreed. Clara was intelligent, but she was also deliberate. The note she received, the warning, contained a specific blend of wood smoke and dried rose, and the aroma lingered on the wax. Hermione scowled. How does that prove anything? Only one individual in the village uses that particular blend for their pipe tobacco. Miss Marple replied, "Mr. Stir." She opened her small notebook, but there was more. Clara prepared the candle with orris root to recreate Ivy Holloway's perfume. It was meant to stir memory. Guilt force a reaction, she told Reverend Cresswell to watch, who flinched, and he didn't see anything. Miss Marple paused. He wasn't the one who lit the candle. You were. Hermione looked down. And I saw nothing, which is precisely why Stir stepped in. He knew Clara had prepared the candle as a kind of trap. He'd overheard something, perhaps her conversation with Dorothy, or Clara suspected it implicated the old vicar. But Ivy had never named him. Instead, she described movements and words. It wasn't until Clara saw Lionel Stir, who had recently relocated to the area, that something clicked. A face from long ago, possibly a voice she hadn't forgotten. Hermione whispered she meant to expose him, yes, but she wanted proof first. She hoped guilt would do what evidence couldn't. Miss Marple opened her handbag and withdrew a folded sheet, part of the parish logbook. "This is a page Clara tore from the register. Ivy Holloway's name was entered here as a domestic assistant. But the final note, scribbled in haste, reads, 'Gone without a word.' No further inquiry, and the signature." Hermione looked closer. Her voice was hollow. Lionel stirred. He served as legal advisor to the Desaisy at the time. Miss Marple explained. He wrote the dismissal, smoothed the records, arranged her removal, likely under pressure from those above who wanted it forgotten. Hermione looked stunned. "He's been here for 3 years. Miss Marple nodded. Long enough to believe the past had been buried, but secrets like Ivy's don't stay buried, especially not when someone like Clara Renner decides to dig. Hermione sat in silence. Clara feared she woe. Hermione lamented sadly that she died in her own trap. She was bold, Miss Marple said, and she miscalculated, but in doing so, she forced the truth to emerge. Ivy's name has returned to the register, this time not as a footnote, but as a reckoning. The fire produced a quiet pop. Hermione rose slowly and moved to the window outside the hamlet, carrying a youngster with a skipping rope. As a distant bicycle bell rung, "Will they know?" She asked the folks only what they wanted to say. "Miss Marple, some truths don't shout. They settle like ash softly and for good." Hermione closed her eyes. Miss Marple grabbed for her knitting, the needles clicking quietly outside. The wind moved slightly, brushing the curtains like a breath. Chapter 13. 1 week later, the sky above St. Mary Me had turned clean and pale, as if the clouds had finally exhausted their secrets. The village had begun to exhale, but not fully. There was no scandal in the paper, no loud announcement of guilt, just the sudden departure of Mr. Lionel Sturt, and a few murmurs that he had taken ill and left to recuperate in the north. Miss Marple sat in her garden, her shawl tucked over her shoulders. A letter open on her lap from Chief Inspector Crotto. Miss Marple folded the letter with delicate fingers and slid it back into its envelope. Not a confession in court, but a confession in ink. Sometimes that was all the world allowed. Dorothy Pike appeared at the gate, holding a modest bouquet of snowdrops for Miss Renewer, she said softly. They placed the flowers together on the church steps. She frightened me, Dorothy whispered, but I think she was trying to protect us in her own way. She was, Miss Marple confirmed. Miss Marple stared toward the church window where light poured through leaded glass. It was meant to be a sign, but it became a weapon. A reminder that even tiny rituals can be corrupted when fear drives the hand that lights the flame. Dorothy hesitated. Do you believe the village will forget? Miss Marple gave a weak smile. The town will soften it. They'll say she was unpleasant, because something bad happened, that a man departed suddenly, and perhaps it was better that way. She hesitated. But we won't forget. Dorothy nodded. Later that evening, the vicar held a quiet memorial service, not for Clara Renishaw, who had already been buried with simple rites, but for Ivy Holloway. Miss Marple sat near the back, unseen, listening as Reverend Cresswell read her name aloud for the first time in years. Ivy Holloway, unremembered until now, lost not by death, but by silence. We name her here in the open. No one spoke during the closing hymn, but when it ended the hush felt fuller than any applause. Clara caught Miss Marple's arm gently. I meant to tell you, she said, voice soft. Clara's will left behind a sealed envelope addressed to you. Miss Marple took it that night. Inside was a single page. If this reaches you, Jane, then you must know I never intended to die. I meant only to expose. I suppose I underestimated how deep some people bury the past, or how far they'll go to silence it. But if you're reading this, I trust your eyes have seen what mine could not name aloud. My thanks, my respect, Clara. Miss Marple folded the page and pressed it flat beneath her palm. No drama, no bitterness, just the quiet dignity of a woman who'd chosen truth over comfort, even when it cost her everything. The next morning life resumed its usual rhythm. The butcher reopened, the postmistress returned to scowling, and spring made its slow advance. Crocuses bloomed by the war. Memorial children played marbles in the square. The village, like so many before it, had survived its brush with something darker, but not unchanged. And as Miss Marple stirred her tea by the morning light, she knew that the most dangerous poison was never in a cup or even a candle. It was the kind poured gently into silence and left to harden unseen.